My school life was a nightmare. I never did well in school socially. I was no good at math, which is really weird because musicians, are supposed to think mathematically, but I never have. So I was not good at math. I was good at basic math. I could do everything up to algebra, and then I started having difficulty with that. But my main problem in school was that I went to school starting in the mid 70s into the mid 80s. And in those days, it's unbelievable how much things have changed in 40 years. Back in those days, like bullying, they complain about bullying now. Good Lord. If they went through what I went through, and a lot of us went through in school when I was a kid, it was terrifying. I lived in utter terror all the time. I was beat up, I was abused, I was called all kinds of foul names, and just terrorized by people because I was different. When I initially started school, I was much smaller and frail. I was sickly as a child, and I had seasonal asthma, and I used to get bronchitis every year, and I'd miss 2 or 3 weeks of school in the wintertime every year. And I would I would go to school probably half the school year and still get an 80 or 70 or an 80. Like I was bored in school, and I was terrified in school because the people that were there, not all of them, obviously, but there was a vast number of them that were not good. And it was tough. It was really, really tough. I was different as a child. I didn't fit into any of the norms because my next oldest brother was 16 years older than me. My parents were aged. Both of my parents were in their 50s and came from an older culture, in Cape Breton than was going on in London, Ontario. And I gravitated to older people. Kids my own age disinterested me. They just weren't they weren't people that I would gravitate to because they didn't have any knowledge that I wanted. So I always wanted to be older than I was, and I acted older than I was. And my I had a lot of tough times because my mother was a psychopath, threatened to kill me all the time, but yet she was afraid I would get hurt in gym class. So I was held out of gym for most of my school life. I'd have to go do something else while gym class went on. And I was frail. I was not in the best of shape when I was a kid. And there's reasons for that. I'm going to get into that in this episode, but I had, I broke my tailbone off at one point, fallen down a set of stairs, broke my tailbone off, and it healed weird. And I did a forward roll one day in gym class before all this, keeping me before she was keeping me out of gym. I did this forward roll off of an elevated surface onto the gym, on a floor mat, and I did something to my middle back in between my shoulder blades. There was a loud crack, and then I was in pain, and I was like 8 years old. And I stayed in pain. The pain lasted well into my adult years. I did something stupid to myself. I still don't know exactly what it was, but later on, doctors found the scar tissue around my coccyx, and they found the the fluid in the middle of my spine. Like I did stupid things, when I was a kid as well. As I got older, when I got, 10, 11 years old, I thought I was Evel Knievel, and I was riding, jumping my BMX bike off of stuff over ramps and jumping off of buildings in the snowbanks. And I hurt myself numerous times because I was just reckless. My mother was a suffocator. Didn't want me to do anything. I couldn't do anything because she was so afraid something would happen to me. And at the same time, this is a woman who would point a gun at me. So it was a messed up time when I entered school and saw how other children lived. I was angry and confused, to say the least. And but then then the bullying started, and I started to see at that early age, just how unpleasant humans could be. And it was a bit of a shock. There was a guy I hung out with whom I loved dearly. He was one of the coolest kids in the whole school, and I was probably 7 years old, And first of all, I'll just go a step back and say that I skipped the second grade because by the time I was through the first grade, it was evident to my teachers that I already was reading at a 7th and 8th grade level. My mother had taught me to read. I was quite a talented, creative writer at that time. I could write short stories at the drop of a hat, and I wrote a short story for, my teacher, and he gave it to the principal, and the principal read it and couldn't believe, it was a story about a grizzly bear attack, a guy in the woods camping, and it was because I was even then a big fan of thrillers and horror and Stephen King, and I read The Stand when it came out when I was a kid. That's the kind of reading I was doing. So I had skipped the second grade altogether. So I think I was in grade 3 or so, or something like that, when I was 7 years old, and so I had this buddy, and we hung out all the time because he was nice to me. He never picked on me. He was nice to me. And I liked him. I thought he was the bee's knees, man. He was a tough guy, and he was taller than me by a head, and he was always laughing and joking, and always wanted to do crazy crap, and we'd get off out in the back of the schoolyard at the end of the soccer field, and there was an old dilapidated chain link fence, and then right beyond that was woods. So we'd run out there in the recess and the lunch break, and we'd find trees and be swinging around on branches like Tarzan and running here and there and playing all kinds of, war games and acting like maniacs back there. Who could outdo the other fellow, And we used to do that all the time. We'd just sneak off and have our own play date out in the woods there, just friggin' laughing and acting like maniacs. And so one day, we were back there doing our recess deal, laughing and carrying on, and these 3 or 4 older kids, like much older, probably 2 or 3 grades above us, came to the fence. We would go under the fence because it was kind of leaning and it was sort of half fallen over. We were small enough to get up underneath this fence, go in there. These 3 or 4 guys came roaring down to the fence there one day and started calling us all kinds of names, right? Like, it's offensive. I know it's offensive today. It was definitely offensive then, but the worst thing you could say to anybody in those days was accused of being gay, right? So that was a normal insult. Just they pick on you relentlessly, and in those times it was a different world. It was a bad place for that. Those two queers are in there, blah blah blah. And what are you doing in there, And then they fixated on my buddy, Nelson. And they were like, yeah, we're going to get him. And so they start trying to come over the fence, and we're in there. And I looked over at Nelson, and they were cursing at him and calling him all kinds of names. And I looked over at him, and I saw the most abject terror I had ever seen on a person's face. He looked utterly horrified for his life. It shocked me when I looked over at him. And and they were screaming at him, we're going to get you, we're going to get you. And we just both he was kind of poised in a cat-like kind of state with his eyes wide, bulging eyes. He was just terrified, and I could see him looking for a place to run because he was fast. God, he was a fast runner. I was a fast runner too. And so we both kind of just wheeled and turned and ran. And they were directing as much hatred at me as him. They were going to get it, but they were really, really ticked at him. And I thought we were both dead. So I ran for only about 8 or 9 seconds deeper into the woods. And when I stopped and I realized I could hear all these voices way off to my left. And I looked behind me, and there wasn't a soul behind me. They didn't come after me at all. They all went after Nelson. And I could hear them yelling, we're going to get you, and calling him all these names. And I never saw him anymore that day. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I went home that night, and I went back to school the next day, and I saw him in the playground that day, and I said, what happened? What happened to you? What happened with those guys? And he was like, they couldn't catch me. And he was laughing about it. And, yeah, he was laughing about it. He was like, they couldn't catch, and they couldn't have caught. He was so fast, they couldn't catch him. And he said he just ran. He ran basically the length of the fence and out onto the road, and came back in the front of the school, and they never even knew they had lost him. He was so fast ahead of them, they couldn't catch him. And yeah, he was black. And the things that they were yelling at him were horrible. Absolutely horrible. And it's the first time I ever saw anything like that. The first time I ever realized that human beings could be that ugly and want to hurt someone just because their skin color was different. That's how I found out. So when I look at what's going on in the world right now, and I realize this is pre-recorded, uploaded on a certain date. I hope that when people look back on this time in our lives here on this earth, that we realize how unnecessary it is to use anything as a metric to describe anyone except that they're just human. They're not black, they're not white, they're not straight, they're not gay, they're not anything. They're human beings. And as soon as you say that I talked to that black guy, or I talked to that gay guy, or I talked to that whatever guy, as soon as you start to use those metrics, you separate us as humans, and that's wrong. It's wrong. We're all the same. And until we can really stop using all that language and making that metric so important, which is not important whatsoever, there's never going to be any justice. There's never going to be any justice. So that's my take on that. And it was something it's something that stuck with me for my whole life. And it made me more sensitive to the situation. And I swore I would never raise my hand or my voice at anyone because of the color of their skin. And I never did. And I've always said, I don't care what color your skin is. I just don't care. I just care that you're not an arsehole. That's the metric I use. So, yeah, that was a moment in my life that changed everything. And, almost 50 years later, still kind of sitting here, just watching the same things unfold on a global scale, and I have all my life. And I wish I wasn't, but I am. We all are. So there was one more thing important about my buddy Nelson that is kind of a strange story, and I'll leave it up to you how much credence you want to put in it. I'm not sure how much even I put in it, but it is weird. It is something that I never thought about at the time, but in later years I did. But on one of the sessions playing in the woods back there, we used to have, we went back there one day. We were swinging on a tree branch that was attached way up the tree, about 15 feet, and it was a long branch, probably 8 foot long, and we were jumping up and grabbing it and swinging all around. It was just like swinging on a vine in the woods, in the jungle or something. We were having a field day out there, like playing all superhero crap and just swinging back all around this branch. And we finally swung on it so much that it pulled out of the tree. And when it pulled out of the tree, it brought this huge hunk of tree with it, which was like a knot at the end, which was easily the size of like a red brick. It was this giant hunk of wood on the end of this branch. And so Nelson was like, well, we don't need this anymore. And he started swinging it around his head to fire it. He was going to fire it, see if he could get it over the fence out onto the soccer field. And me, being 7 and not that coordinated sometimes, I managed to walk right into this thing when he was swinging it around his head. And it hit me right in the corner of I still have the lump on my skull. It hit me and knocked me right out. It knocked me out. And Nelson saved my life. He panicked, and he jumped the fence and he ran to the school, and he come back with the teacher, and I was come to by then, and I still remember the look on his face, like he was mortified. He didn't know what to do. He felt so bad. And but I was okay. Like we got out. He helped me get out underneath the fence, and him and the teacher kind of walked me back to the school, and that was all good. And I had this huge egg on my forehead. It was the size of a golf ball, and it was like green and blue and red, and it was horrendous looking, and. So that was fine. I went to the nurse's office, and I seemed to be okay. Everybody was cool, and of course, never held a thing against Nelson. That was an accident, a complete accident. And so all was good. Went home, went to school the next day, the big knot on my head. And then that night, the second night, I I was sleeping in my mother's room. We had a weird setup in our house because my mother and father didn't sleep in the same bed. But occasionally they would. I don't know. Whatever. That's whatever that was. I don't know. But there was a master bedroom that had a large bed and a small bed off to the side, and there was another bedroom down the hall with a single bed in it. My dad slept there. My mother slept in this little bed, and I slept in this bed in this master bedroom. So normally, my mother would come in at night and sit there in the bed with me and read to me, and then she'd go to bed and I go to sleep and everything. We hunky dory. So that night she gets up in the middle of the night, about probably 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning to go to the bathroom. She looks in the bed and I am in the middle of a grand mal seizure. I'm straight out like a board and vibrating, and my head's back and my eyes are rolled back in my head. And so she jumped on the bed and grabbed me and she didn't know what to do. She should have rolled me on on my side, but she didn't do that. Instead, she knew it was a danger of me swallowing my tongue. So she tried to get her fingers in my mouth, and I bit her fingers just about off. I bit them to the bone. She took, I think, 7 stitches later that night when we got to the hospital. So she was calling for my dad. They called the ambulance. I remember none of this, of course, because it happened in my sleep. So I woke up in the ambulance with my father, and I'll never forget it. I woke up and I was really out of it, and I was looking at Dad, and I was like, I didn't know where I was. I knew that we were in an ambulance, but I couldn't. I don't know why I knew that, because I'd never been in one before, but I was looking up at my father, and he was pale. And he was a dark-skinned man. He was a French-Acadian, black hair, black eyes, almost all like a First Nations. He looked like a Mi'kmaq First Nations man. Really, all my family has that sort of. On my dad's side, had that trait, and so he was hovering over me on the stretcher, and he was as pale as a ghost. I couldn't believe what he looked like. And I don't even remember if I asked him what was going on or what was going on, but next thing I remember, I'm in a hospital bed, and I'm literally, I'm throwing up in this, my father's holding this plastic, kidney-shaped plastic, like cup, bin, something, tray, and I'm throwing up in it, and I'm throwing up a liquid that is completely transparent, the color of lime jello. Green. And the doctor is in there and saying, well, he's throwing up pure bile. And so we don't know what's going on. So I ended up they kept me in the hospital a couple of days, and I ended up they gave me a CAT scan, which was really interesting. These things are sort of vague memories to me, but they were kind of a little bit traumatic and a little bit exciting. I remember going in the CAT scan, and they put my head, and all I could think of is it's like a giant pacifier. They put your head inside a soother, and it was like a big rubber. It seemed like a big rubber thing, a head condom, and in this really loud machine, and it took pictures, of course, of my interiors, and so they ended up after when they were letting me out of the hospital, they put me on Dilantin, which apparently is one of the most dangerous anti-epileptic drugs you can possibly take. And they gave no explanation for this. They just told my mother that I had to take it. But it turned out that I was not epileptic. I had a seizure from the head injury. But they misdiagnosed it, of course, and it wasn't until 3 or 4 years later. I was probably 11 years old. This happened when I was 7. I was like 11 years old when we got a new doctor, and he looked at the prescription and said, why is he on this medication? Because it's not safe. And my mother says, well, they told me he's an epileptic. And the doctor said, well, has he had any seizures since this one seizure? And she goes, no. And he says, well, he's not epileptic then. Like, what's going on? So they took me off it. But here's the interesting thing. Years later, my brothers and I were sitting around, and we suddenly, I think I was telling the story about that getting hit in the head. And we suddenly hit upon this concept that it did actually, my development as a musician did actually coincide with this head injury and this seizure. After that happened, my guitar playing exploded even further than it had exploded in the first 2 years, from the ages of 5 to 7. After this happened, it seemed like I learned at an exponential rate that was unbelievable. And because I think we were having a conversation about people that get struck by lightning and can suddenly play the piano, like, or whatever. I guess there have been cases of that. And so we talked about that at length, my brothers and I, and even my wife and I have had a chuckle over it, but it is kind of cute to think possibly that maybe the head injury actually did rewire something in my brain, or the medication I was on needlessly for 3 or 4 years might have rewired me. I don't know. I'm not sure what the case is, but it is kind of funny. And so, yeah, wherever Nelson is, I might owe him a debt of gratitude if he hit me in the head and turned me into a guitar player. But as I said, though, I was already playing far beyond my years in those first 2 years that I started. But that is a kind of a charming idea. I think about it sometimes and chuckle, because it is kind of odd. And I remember in those years, 7, 8 years old, learning some pretty complicated stuff by Chet that I play to this very day, and my version of those tunes has evolved over time. It's like they live inside me like little, other people. And one of the tunes that I learned back then, early on, I think right after Blowin' in the Wind from Chet, was a tune called Windy and Warm. And at the time, I didn't know the significance of the tune, but it was and has always been and became, after those years, one of the most recognizable tunes that Chet ever played. Chet fans, as soon as they hear it, know it. And it's been covered a million times and played by everybody. But it's one of those tunes that I learned in that period, that strange, weird period of, the schoolhouse, the other weirdness in my own home, and the trying to navigate life as a 5 to 7 year old boy who wasn't really interested in anything else in life except music. And I think the quest for knowledge. I was thirsty for knowledge of any kind, and it had to be usable, applicable knowledge, which is maybe why I didn't do so well in math. In those days, I didn't think math was applicable to everyday life as it actually is. And so, yeah, that tune is a throwback to my earliest days as a player, and still to this day is one of I still am filled with joy by playing it. I remember taking it apart piece by piece and getting it put back together, and it was sort of one of those moments in my musical upbringing where all the tools in my toolbox started to coalesce, and the thumb muscle memory was starting to be there, and all the muscle memory was starting to be there. It came really early for me, and yeah, and again, of course, it's from Chet. So yeah, it's a great tune, and whenever I play it, I feel like I'm 7 again.